People are held in immigration detention because there's some sort of issue with their immigration status. Their right to stay in the UK is being questioned.
Almost all of the places where people can be detained are now built to Category B prison conditions, so it's actually much more like being in a prison.
Immigration detention has a terrible cost for the people concerned.
The UK has breached Article 3, the prohibition on torture and inhuman and degrading treatment, several times in its use of immigration detention.
It's very hard to be locked up somewhere where you don't know when you're going to get out.
Mental health collapses, essentially. It's taken a horrible physical toll on some people as well. A lot of people in immigration detention haven't actually committed any kind of crime. They've perhaps broken immigration laws, they've maybe made a claim for asylum that hasn't succeeded, but they haven't actually committed a normal criminal offence like theft or anything violent or anything like that.
What's important about it is that it doesn't require any court order in the first place.
It's the one area where we allow people to be locked up, sometimes for very long periods, years and years, without accessing a court.
The criminal jurisdiction requires that someone is charged with an offence. They have due process, they have a lawyer, they have to be given a trial.
Where you're taken into administrative detention, immigration detention, there's none of that. It's simply a relatively junior official at the Home Office decides that they've got spaces in detention or they've got spaces on a flight back to a certain country, and so they take a decision to bring you into detention. That's then followed through often with essentially a dawn raid. The number of people who are actually released into the community from immigration detention is surprisingly high. I think it's as high as around 50%. Months or sometimes years later, they're released back into the community and you're left thinking, well, what on earth was the point of that?
Immigration detention is an affront to the rule of law because in the English common law, individual liberty is one of the cornerstones of the freedoms that we all hold dear.
In every part of the world, in every culture and every society, freedom is something that we all experience and it's something that we all enjoy. Taking that away from an individual by confining them in a specific space, often very far away from where they are familiar with, very far away from their family, in itself is very problematic. And when you combine that with that they haven't actually committed a criminal offence, the whole situation becomes very problematic, morally, legally.
At law, the presumption is that someone will not be detained unless it's necessary, and they'll only be detained for the shortest possible time. That's also the Home Office's published policy. That is not often observed. People are detained when there isn't really any prospect of removing them, and they're detained when they might be able to be granted bail. So the Home Office for a bail hearing will produce what's called the bail summary, which is a list of reasons why the Home Office says that the person should remain in detention. One
of the concerns that I've had with some cases I've dealt with is that the way that the Home Office prepares bail applications is that they're really looking for, dare I say, excuses to detain a person rather than reasons to detain. They're forced by the legal process to try and come up with certain reasons and essentially they're really manufacturing them, I'm sorry to say. When
the system as a whole is failing, then all of those small parts add up to create a deeply flawed, deeply incompetent bureaucracy. But each individual officer in the Home Office doesn't take responsibility because they can always blame a different wing, a different officer within the Home Office for making that mistake.
Well, one of the big differences between immigration detention and a criminal conviction is that there aren't the guidelines. There's simply no equivalent at all for immigration detention. There's no consistency and judges are really left up to themselves about how long they allow somebody to be detained for. Some judges, in my experience, are fair. They understand that immigration detention has a very negative impact on the individuals concerned, and they understand that months of detention is actually a very long time. That's equivalent to a pretty serious prison sentence and criminal conviction. Unfortunately, there are some judges who don't seem to understand that.
Another real challenge for judges is dealing with people who don't have a legal representative.
Because they're not entitled to legal aid, unless they've got friends and family who are willing to support them, there's just no way that they can afford to pay for a lawyer or pay for legal advice.
Immigration law is really complicated. The legal procedures are really complicated. It's changing all the time.
For a lay individual to try to make sense of those rules is extremely difficult. When that lay person is someone whose first language isn't even English, who's often destitute because for a significant amount of time they haven't been permitted to work in the UK, there is a serious difficulty for that individual to represent themselves. Then the issue is, how do they afford legal representation when they simply have no money? Legal aid has been drastically cut for them.